A smile can hide a very sharp secret. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The December afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead like a comfortable old shawl, bringing with it the first proper snowfall of the winter. Inside the village hall, the Women's Institute had transformed the usually austere space into something approaching festive warmth. Paper chains hung from the rafters, and someone had managed to coax the ancient radiators into producing actual heat, though they still clanked and wheezed with the effort. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair near the tea table, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a particularly intricate pattern. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her handiwork, but her pale blue eyes moved frequently from her stitches to observe the gentle dramas unfolding around her. At her age, she had learned that the most interesting aspects of human nature revealed themselves when people believed themselves unobserved. The winter gathering, as Mrs. Beatrice Larkin insisted on calling it, had drawn a respectable crowd, despite the weather. Mrs. Larkin herself bustled about with her usual air of benevolent authority, her clipboard never far from hand as she orchestrated the afternoon's charitable activities. The proceeds, she had announced to anyone within earshot, would go toward repairs to the church roof, a worthy cause that had the additional benefit of making everyone feel virtuous about consuming tea and cakes. "Miss Marple, you must try one of Mrs. Henderson's mince pies," Mrs. Larkin declared, pausing in her rounds to press a plate upon the elderly lady. "She's used her grandmother's recipe, haven't you, dear?" Mrs. Henderson, a nervous woman who had moved to the village only 6 months earlier, colored slightly at the attention. "Oh, it's nothing special, really. I do hope they're not too sweet." She glanced anxiously toward her husband, who stood near the window engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated conversation with Dr. Haydick about the state of the village roads. Miss Marple accepted the pie with a gentle smile. "How thoughtful of you, Mrs. Henderson. There's something so comforting about family recipes, don't you think? They carry such history within them." She took a delicate bite, noting how the younger woman's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the remaining pies on the plate. Near the small stage where the church choir would later perform carols, Mr. Julian Ashford held court with his usual charm. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 weeks earlier, ostensibly to catalogue the contents of his recently deceased aunt's cottage, though his stay had extended far beyond what such a task would reasonably require. His dark, good looks and easy manner had certainly made an impression on several of the village ladies, particularly young Miss Patricia Fleming, who hung on his every word with an attention that made her mother purse her lips in disapproval. "The Victorian pieces are quite remarkable," Mr. Ashford was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone educated men used when discussing valuable objects. "My aunt had excellent taste, though I suspect she had no idea of the true worth of some items." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. Something in his tone struck her as oddly rehearsed, as though he had delivered this same speech multiple times. She glanced toward Mrs. Fleming, who was watching her daughter with the sharp attention of a woman who had seen too many charming young men come and go. The afternoon progressed with the comfortable predictability of village gatherings until Reverend Clement announced it was time for the carol singing. As voices rose in "O Come, All Ye Faithful," Miss Marple noticed Mr. Henderson slip quietly from the room, ostensibly to step outside for air. Dr. Haydick, she observed, watched him go with a frown that suggested professional concern rather than mere social interest. It was during the third verse that Mrs. Henderson suddenly stopped singing. Her face had gone quite pale and she swayed slightly on her feet. Several people reached out to steady her, but she waved them away with a brittle smile. "I'm perfectly fine," she insisted, though her voice carried a tremor that suggested otherwise. "Perhaps just a bit of fresh air." She moved toward the small cloakroom at the back of the hall, where coats hung in neat rows and the door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple watched her progress with the quiet attention she might give to a particularly complex stitch pattern. The scream, when it came, cut through silent night like a blade through silk. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen in the cloakroom doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, staring at something the others could not yet see. In the sudden, terrible silence that followed, Miss Marple carefully set down her knitting and rose from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had, unfortunately, witnessed such moments before. Dr. Haydock pushed through the small crowd that had instinctively surged toward the cloakroom, his medical training overriding the shock that held the others frozen. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her pale blue eyes already cataloguing details that others, in their distress, would certainly miss. The narrow cloakroom smelled of damp wool and mothballs. Among the hanging coats, Julian Ashford lay motionless on the worn linoleum, his handsome face turned toward the skirting board. A thick, homespun muffler had been wound twice around his neck, the knot pulled tight with more strength than skill. His eyes stared past the row of coat pegs with that terrible stillness that only death could bring. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock said sharply, kneeling beside the body. His fingers sought a pulse they would not find. After a moment, he looked up grimly. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. He's been dead perhaps 10 minutes, no more." The pronouncement fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathered villagers. Patricia Fleming made a small, wounded sound before her mother drew her close with protective firmness. Mrs. Larkin, recovering her composure with admirable speed, began organizing the practical necessities that sudden death demands. "Mr. Partridge, telephone the police at once," she commanded, "and someone must contact Inspector Slack." Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her knitting forgotten in her hands as she observed both the scene and the people around her. The muffler that had been used as a weapon was clearly not Mr. Ashford's. He favored silk scarves and fashionable accessories, not thick country wool. The knot had been tied by someone unfamiliar with such garments, pulled tight in desperation rather than expertise. Mrs. Henderson had retreated to the far wall, her earlier nervousness now explained in the most tragic way possible. But Miss Marple noticed something curious in her manner, not just shock and horror, but a kind of brittle relief, as though a long-dreaded moment had finally passed. "I only came in for my scarf," Mrs. Henderson whispered to anyone who would listen. I never thought." But Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Henderson throughout the afternoon, and she had worn no scarf. Small lies, she knew, often preceded larger ones, and people told them first to convince themselves. Mr. Henderson himself appeared in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots and rubbing his hands against the cold. His bewildered expression as he took in the scene was genuine enough, but Miss Marple noted how quickly his confusion turned to something approaching panic when he realized the implications of his absence during the crucial moments. "I was outside," he said, too loudly and too quickly. "Getting some air. Ask anyone. I've been walking in the garden since the carols began." Young Patricia Fleming, despite her distress, watched the proceedings with the sharp curiosity of youth. "He was so charming," she murmured to her mother. "Who could have wanted to hurt him?" Mrs. Fleming's response was barely audible, but Miss Marple's keen hearing caught it. "Someone who knew him better than we did, I suspect." The arrival of Constable Polk brought a semblance of official order to the chaos. He was a good man, but clearly out of his depth with such a serious matter. His efforts to preserve the scene were earnest, if somewhat ineffective, as the villagers continued to mill about, their shocked whispers creating an undercurrent of speculation and fear. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe without seeming to do so. She watched Mrs. Henderson's trembling hands, noted how Mr. Henderson kept glancing toward the window as though planning an escape route, observed the way Mrs. Fleming kept her daughter close while her own eyes remained sharp and calculating. The winter gathering had transformed from a cozy village affair into something far more sinister. The paper chains still hung cheerfully from the rafters. The radiators continued their comfortable wheezing, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Death had come to St. Mary Mead in the most unexpected way, and Miss Marple knew from long experience that the most obvious explanations were rarely the correct ones. As they waited for Inspector Slack's arrival, she began her mental catalogue of observations and inconsistencies. The muffler that didn't belong to the victim, the absent scarf that Mrs. Henderson claimed to have been seeking, the convenient timing of Mr. Henderson's walk in the garden, each detail would need careful consideration. The game, as she had learned to think of such tragic puzzles, had begun in earnest. Someone in this room had committed murder, and they undoubtedly believed themselves clever enough to escape detection. Miss Marple settled back to watch and listen, knowing that given enough time and observation, human nature would inevitably reveal its secrets. Inspector Slack arrived with the efficiency of a man who had seen too many village tragedies to be surprised by another. His heavy footsteps echoed through the hall as he surveyed the scene, immediately commanding the attention that Constable Polk had struggled to maintain. He was a practical man who prided himself on quick results, though Miss Marple had observed on previous occasions that his desire for swift conclusions sometimes caused him to overlook the subtler currents of human behavior. "Right then," he announced, his voice cutting through the anxious whispers. "No one leaves until I've spoken with each of you. Mrs. Henderson, you found the body. Let's start there." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with visible reluctance, her hands still trembling as she recounted her story. Miss Marple noticed how carefully she avoided the inspector's direct gaze, a small detail that spoke volumes about her state of mind. "I went to fetch my scarf from the cloakroom," she repeated, the words carrying the rehearsed quality of a story told multiple times. "That's when I found poor Mr. Ashford. He was lying there with that dreadful thing around his neck." Inspector Slack made methodical notes, his pen scratching across the paper. "What time exactly, Mrs. Henderson?" "During silent night. I'd been feeling faint. The heat in here, you understand." Dr. Haydock provided his preliminary assessment with clinical detachment. Death occurred 10 to 15 minutes before discovery. Strangulation by ligature. That muffler. The victim appears to have been taken by surprise, possibly from behind. No signs of struggle. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed this information. Mrs. Henderson had indeed looked distressed, but her discomfort had begun earlier, during Mr. Ashford's conversation about valuable antiques. The timing suggested complexities that went beyond overheated rooms. Constable Polk cleared his throat, respectfully. "Inspector, found this in the deceased's coat pocket." He held up a small leather notebook filled with neat handwriting. Inspector Slack examined it, his eyebrows rising. "List of local residents with detailed notes about their backgrounds and financial circumstances. Quite thorough research, this." The revelation rippled through the room like a stone thrown into still water. Someone had been conducting careful surveillance of the villagers, gathering information that could prove either valuable or dangerous. Young Patricia surprised everyone by speaking clearly despite her distress. Mr. Ashford asked many questions about the village throughout the afternoon, about old families and local history. He seemed particularly interested in who had lived here longest. She paused, glancing nervously at her mother. He asked about the Hendersons specifically, whether they'd been here long. I told him only 6 months. Mrs. Henderson's face went ashen while her husband moved protectively closer. Miss Marple observed how his protective instincts seemed to war with his own obvious anxiety. Mrs. Larkin, consulting her clipboard with characteristic efficiency, added another piece to the puzzle. "I must say, we were all rather surprised to learn Mrs. Cardew had a nephew. She lived quite alone for 15 years and never mentioned family." This information hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Miss Marple's pale eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face, noting how each person processed this suggestion that Mr. Ashford might not have been who he claimed to be. Around the room, theories began to crystallize as shock gave way to speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to be outdone in matters of social consequence, was already holding court near the tea urn. "Always knew there was something untoward about him," she pronounced with authority. "Far too charming for his own good. Probably some sordid affair that caught up with him." Mr. Henderson, attempting to explain his earlier absence to Dr. Haydock, gestured vaguely toward the sealed cloakroom. "Just needed air, old chap. Never thought I'd return to this." Miss Marple noted how his eyes darted around the room, assessing who might have witnessed his departure and return. The general consensus seemed to favor an outsider theory, someone unknown to the village who had committed the crime and vanished into the snowy night. It was a comforting notion that placed the blame safely beyond their familiar community. Miss Marple allowed these various narratives to swirl around her like threads in a complex tapestry. She understood that people created stories not to uncover truth, but to make sense of the incomprehensible. The police would focus on facts and evidence, but she would focus on the people, on subtle shifts in expression, nervous habits, carefully chosen words, and telling silences. The initial shock was slowly giving way to something more insidious: suspicion. And suspicion, Miss Marple knew from long experience, was far more dangerous than grief. In the gathering twilight outside the village hall windows, the cozy winter gathering had transformed into something altogether more sinister, where neighbors eyed each other with newfound wariness, and every innocent gesture carried the weight of potential guilt. Inspector Slack's methodical approach began to impose order on the chaos of speculation and shock that had engulfed the village hall. His attention, with the focused intensity of a man who preferred clear-cut solutions, had settled upon Mr. Henderson with increasing conviction. The circumstantial evidence was building like storm clouds on a summer afternoon, dark, ominous, and seemingly inevitable. "Mr. Henderson," the inspector continued, his pen poised over the leather notebook, "these observations about your financial circumstances are remarkably detailed for casual village gossip. Recent investment losses, Cheltenham bank inquiries, possible creditor difficulties. Quite specific information for a man you claim barely to have known." Mr. Henderson's face had taken on the pallor of old parchment, and his hands trembled slightly as he attempted to maintain his composure. "I don't understand how he could have known such things. We've been most discreet about our temporary difficulties." Mrs. Henderson's grip on her husband's arm tightened visibly, her knuckles white against the dark wool of his jacket. Miss Marple observed how the younger woman's distress seemed to encompass more than simple shock at her husband's predicament. There was a quality of resignation about her manner, as though she had been expecting such a moment for some time. Dr. Haydock, with his medical man's directness, provided clinical context to the growing suspicion. "The physical evidence suggests someone with considerable strength, Inspector. The muffler was pulled tight with significant force. Not the work of someone weak or hesitant." This observation caused several glances to drift toward Mr. Henderson's robust frame, built by years of outdoor work before his recent venture into more sedentary pursuits. Miss Marple noted how he seemed to recognize the assessment in those looks, his shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken accusation. Young Patricia, despite her mother's restraining hand, spoke with the clarity that sometimes comes to the young in moments of crisis. "But, Inspector, if Mr. Ashford was investigating everyone, wouldn't that give many people reasons to want him silenced? Surely we can't all be suspects simply because he was curious about our affairs." Mrs. Fleming's sharp intake of breath suggested her daughter had touched upon something uncomfortably close to truth. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully between mother and daughter, noting how Mrs. Fleming's protective instincts seemed to war with her own obvious anxiety about what revelations might yet emerge. The discovery of the charity store connection had provided Inspector Slack with what he clearly considered a crucial breakthrough. Constable Polk had confirmed that the small card found near the cloakroom matched those used to tag donated items, each bearing a cheerful red wool thread that Mrs. Larkin had insisted would make charity more appealing. "The weapon was taken from within this very room," Slack announced with satisfaction, "which narrows our field considerably. Someone present this afternoon committed murder using materials conveniently at hand." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered this development. The muffler itself told an interesting story to those who understood the language of wool and tension. The stitching was remarkably tight and even, the work of someone with considerable skill and, more importantly, someone who knitted with unusual tension. Such habits, she knew from long experience, were as individual as handwriting and far more difficult to disguise. Mrs. Larkin, consulting her clipboard with characteristic efficiency, attempted to provide clarity about the donated items. "I'm afraid our record-keeping for individual donations isn't as precise as it might be. Several ladies contributed items this morning, and in the rush of preparation, some may have been attributed incorrectly." Inspector Slack seized upon this information with evident satisfaction. "Convenient confusion, wouldn't you say? Makes it impossible to trace the muffler to its source." But Miss Marple was thinking of other things entirely, of the way Mrs. Henderson had looked, not merely shocked, but somehow relieved when she discovered the body, of the scarf she claimed to have been seeking though she had worn none, of the careful rehearsal in Mr. Ashford's manner when discussing valuable antiques. The pieces of the puzzle were present, but they refused to arrange themselves in the pattern Inspector Slack seemed so eager to complete. Around the room, the villagers watched the drama unfold with the mixture of horror and fascination that sudden violence brings to peaceful communities. Mrs. Price Ridley had positioned herself where she could observe every nuance of the proceedings, her sharp features alive with the satisfaction of witnessing scandal unfold. Reverend Clement stood quietly near the window, his kind face troubled by the ugly currents of suspicion that were transforming his parishioners into potential criminals. As Inspector Slack's questions grew more pointed and Mr. Henderson's responses more desperate, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that while the obvious solution might satisfy the demands of justice, it would not satisfy the demands of truth. The real murderer, she suspected, was watching these proceedings with quiet satisfaction, content to let suspicion settle upon the most convenient target while the actual motive remained safely hidden beneath the surface of village respectability. The winter gathering had indeed become something far more sinister than anyone could have anticipated, and Miss Marple settled back to observe with the patient attention of someone who understood that human nature, given sufficient time and pressure, would inevitably reveal its deepest secrets. Inspector Slack's methodical questioning had taken on the rhythm of a man closing in on his quarry, each question designed to tighten the net around Mr. Henderson. The financial evidence from Ashford's notebook provided exactly the kind of clear motive that Slack preferred. Desperate circumstances leading to desperate actions. "The timing is quite convenient, isn't it, Mr. Henderson?" Slack pressed, consulting his notes with satisfaction. "Your walk in the garden coincides precisely with the period when the murder occurred, and these financial difficulties documented here suggest a man who might resort to extreme measures to protect his secrets." Mr. Henderson's composure was cracking visibly under the sustained pressure. His hands trembled as he attempted to explain his movements, and beads of perspiration had appeared on his forehead, despite the winter chill that still permeated the hall. Mrs. Henderson stood beside him with the rigid posture of a woman bracing herself for catastrophe, though Miss Marple observed something curious in her manner. Not the shock of unexpected tragedy, but the weary resignation of someone who had been anticipating disaster for some time. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the charity stall under the pretense of helping Mrs. Larkin organize the remaining items. Her pale blue eyes moved with practiced efficiency over the donated woolens, cataloguing details that others would dismiss as insignificant domestic trivia. The murder weapon itself told a fascinating story to someone versed in the language of yarn and needles. The stitching was remarkably tight and even, the work of someone who knitted with unusual tension, perhaps driven by anxiety or long habit. More intriguing still was a single strand of dark blue wool she had noticed caught on a coat hook in the cloakroom, positioned at shoulder height for someone considerably shorter than the deceased. The wool was of excellent quality, with the particular luster that came from careful spinning and superior materials. It matched neither the homespun muffler used as the weapon nor any garment she could observe among the male villagers, but it bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Fleming's beautifully crafted navy cardigan. The discovery of a second, smaller notebook in Ashford's pocket provided an unexpected complication to Inspector Slack's increasingly confident narrative. Constable Polk read the contents with obvious discomfort, his voice carrying the embarrassment of a man forced to air private matters in public. Mrs. F. shows signs of considerable strain when daughter mentioned. Protective behavior suggests knowledge of something requiring concealment. Worth, investigating family history, particularly regarding P.'s father. The words struck the assembled villagers like a physical blow. Patricia Fleming went white as parchment, while her mother's carefully maintained composure cracked for the first time that afternoon. The protective mask she had worn throughout the proceedings slipped, revealing something far more complex beneath, not mere maternal concern, but the fierce determination of a woman who had spent years guarding dangerous secrets. "How dare he?" Mrs. Fleming whispered, her voice carrying decades of carefully controlled pain. "How dare he pry into matters that concern no one but ourselves?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm as she processed this revelation. The pattern was becoming clearer, though not in the direction Inspector Slack seemed determined to pursue. Mr. Ashford had not been the casual visitor he pretended to be. He had come to St. Mary Mead with specific purposes that extended far beyond cataloguing his supposed aunt's possessions. He was a man who collected secrets with the same methodical precision others might use to collect butterflies, and secrets, as Miss Marple knew from long experience, were among the most dangerous commodities in any small community. Young Patricia, displaying remarkable courage despite her obvious distress, spoke directly to Inspector Slack. "If this man was investigating all of us, then surely anyone might have had reason to want him silenced. Why focus only on Mr. Henderson when there may be others with equally compelling motives?" The question hung in the air with uncomfortable persistence. Around the room, Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in posture and expression that accompanied this challenge. Some villagers relaxing slightly at having suspicion deflected, others tensing with the awareness that their own secrets might yet be exposed to public scrutiny. Mrs. Fleming had moved protectively closer to her daughter, but Miss Marple noticed how the older woman's eyes continued to sweep the room with calculating intensity. There was something almost predatory in her watchfulness, the alertness of someone who had learned to anticipate threats from unexpected quarters. As Inspector Slack prepared to escort Mr. Henderson for further questioning, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that while the obvious solution might satisfy the demands of expedient justice, it would not satisfy the more rigorous demands of truth. The real murderer, she suspected, was watching these proceedings with quiet satisfaction, content to let suspicion settle upon the most convenient target, while the actual motive remained safely concealed beneath layers of village respectability and maternal devotion. Inspector Slack's determination to remove Mr. Henderson for formal questioning had reached an almost theatrical intensity, his confidence buoyed by the mounting circumstantial evidence. Yet as he prepared to escort his primary suspect from the hall, Miss Marple rose from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had noticed something that others had entirely overlooked. "Inspector," she said in her gentle, conversational tone, "I wonder if you might spare just a moment before you proceed. There's something rather curious about the evidence that I think deserves consideration." Slack paused, his experience with the elderly lady's previous insights warring with his eagerness to conclude the case. "What is it, Miss Marple?" She moved toward the cloakroom with small, precise steps, her pale blue eyes taking in details that others had dismissed as insignificant. It's about the muffler used as the weapon. I've been examining the knitting, you see, and it tells quite a fascinating story to those who understand the language of wool and needles. Constable Polk, still guarding the scene, allowed her a brief glance into the narrow space. The homespun muffler lay where Dr. Haydock had placed it, but Miss Marple's attention focused on something else entirely. A single strand of dark blue wool caught on a coat hook at shoulder height, positioned for someone considerably shorter than the deceased. The murder weapon shows remarkably tight, even stitching, she continued, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she spoke. The work of someone who knits compulsively, perhaps during anxious evenings, but this blue thread suggests something quite different. It's excellent quality wool, with the particular luster that comes from superior materials. Mrs. Fleming, who had been maintaining her protective stance beside Patricia, shifted almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the movement, noting how the older woman's hands moved to her navy cardigan, fingers tracing the fine knitted fabric with unconscious defensiveness. The discovery of additional papers in Ashford's belongings provided an unexpected complication to Inspector Slack's increasingly confident narrative. Constable Polk produced a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be official correspondence, documents that cast an entirely different light on the deceased's presence in St. Mary Mead. Letters from a firm of inquiry agents in London, Polk read aloud, his voice carrying obvious discomfort. References to the Cardew investigation and verification of inheritance claims. Seems our Mr. Ashford wasn't just cataloguing antiques, Inspector. The revelation struck the assembled villagers like a physical blow. Mrs. Larkin's clipboard trembled in her hands as she processed the implications, while around the room, carefully maintained facades began to show hairline cracks under the pressure of this new information. Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in posture and expression that accompanied this revelation. Mrs. Henderson's earlier relief now made perfect sense. She had feared exposure of their financial difficulties, but Ashford's interest had clearly extended, far beyond simple monetary troubles. His investigation had been systematic and professional, designed to uncover secrets that went to the very heart of village respectability. Professional inquiry agents, Dr. Haydock murmured, his medical man's directness cutting through the shocked whispers. That explains his rather pointed questions about local families and their histories. He wasn't making casual conversation. He was gathering intelligence. Young Patricia, despite her distress, spoke with the clarity that sometimes comes to the young in moments of crisis. He asked me about Papa, about whether we ever heard from him. I thought it was just polite interest, but now... Her voice trailed off as she looked at her mother with dawning comprehension. Mrs. Fleming's carefully maintained composure showed signs of strain, though she continued to project an air of dignified control. "My husband died many years ago," she said firmly. "Whatever this man's purposes, they have nothing to do with us." But Miss Marple had caught the faint scent of Parma violets that seemed to cling to Mrs. Fleming's clothing, the same old-fashioned fragrance she had detected in the cloakroom beneath the sharper odors of damp wool and mothball. Not proof, certainly, but people rarely left themselves entirely behind, and scent had a way of betraying presence where other evidence might be carefully erased. As Inspector Slack struggled to reassess his investigation in light of these revelations, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution lay not in the obvious financial motives or convenient alibis, but in the complex web of family secrets and buried scandals that Ashford's professional inquiry had begun to unravel. The real murderer, she suspected, was someone whose past could not survive the scrutiny of a determined investigator, someone who had killed not from desperation, but from the fierce protective instinct that drives people to extraordinary lengths when their most carefully guarded secrets face exposure. The revelation of Ashford's true purpose as a professional inquiry agent had transformed the atmosphere in the village hall from shocked speculation to something far more dangerous, the electric tension that comes when long-buried secrets begin to surface. Inspector Slack found himself reassessing not just his primary suspect, but the entire foundation of his investigation, while Miss Marple continued her quiet observations with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth rarely revealed itself in dramatic pronouncements. Mrs. Fleming's carefully maintained composure showed increasing strain as the implications of Ashford's professional investigation became clear. Her protective stance beside Patricia had taken on an almost desperate quality, and Miss Marple noted how the older woman's hands moved repeatedly to smooth her navy cardigan, fingers tracing the fine knitted fabric with unconscious defensiveness. The discovery of additional correspondence in Ashford's belongings provided yet another layer to the increasingly complex picture. Constable Pogg's voice carried obvious reluctance as he read selected passages aloud, his discomfort with airing such private matters evident in every carefully measured word. References to irregular financial arrangements dating back 23 years, he reported, consulting the official letterhead with obvious unease. Mentions of maintained deceptions regarding marital status and daughter's legitimate inheritance rights potentially compromised by fraudulent claims. Patricia's face drained of all color as the carefully constructed narrative of her life began to crumble around her. "What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the shocked murmurs that had begun to ripple through the room. "Mama, what is he talking about?" Mrs. Fleming's response carried the fierce defensiveness of a woman whose deepest secrets faced exposure to public scrutiny. "Some matters are private, Patricia. This man had no right to pry into affairs that concern no one but ourselves." But Miss Marple had noticed something that others overlooked in the drama of revelation and accusation. While attention focused on the emotional confrontation between mother and daughter, she observed Mrs. Larkin's reaction to the financial irregularities mentioned in Ashford's correspondence. The usually unflappable organizer had gone quite still, her clipboard forgotten in hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Dr. Haydock, with his medical man's directness, attempted to provide practical context to the emotional drama unfolding before them. "The physical evidence still suggests someone with considerable strength and determination, Inspector. The muffler was pulled tight with significant force, indicating either great desperation or calculated resolve." Inspector Slack, clearly struggling to reassess his investigation in light of these developments, found his attention torn between multiple potential motives and suspects. The neat case he had been building against Mr. Henderson now seemed insufficient to encompass the complex web of secrets and deceptions that Ashford's investigation had begun to unravel. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully between the various players in this unfolding drama, cataloguing details that others dismissed as insignificant domestic trivia. The faint scent of Parma violets that clung to Mrs. Fleming's clothing, the quality of wool in the thread she had discovered earlier, the nervous habits and telling gestures that revealed far more than words ever could. Around the room, the villagers processed these revelations with the mixture of fascination and horror that accompanies the exposure of long-buried scandals. Mrs. Price Ridley had positioned herself where she could observe every nuance of the proceedings, while Reverend Clement stood quietly near the window, his kind face troubled by the ugly currents of suspicion that were transforming his peaceful parish. The winter afternoon was fading into early evening, and the cozy warmth of the village hall had taken on an oppressive quality as secrets multiplied and suspicions shifted like shadows in candlelight. Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous game Ashford had been playing, using his supposed inheritance as cover for what amounted to systematic blackmail of an entire community. As Inspector Slack prepared to question Mrs. Fleming more directly about the implications of Ashford's investigation, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that while the obvious motives might satisfy the demands of expedient justice, they would not satisfy the more rigorous demands of truth. The real murderer, she suspected, was someone whose secrets ran deeper than fraudulent claims or hidden marriages. Someone who had killed not from desperation, but from the calculating determination of a person who could not afford to have their carefully constructed life examined too closely. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the final pieces of the puzzle remained tantalizingly out of reach, waiting for the right combination of observation and insight to reveal themselves in their full, terrible clarity. The emotional confrontation between Mrs. Fleming and her daughter had created a charged atmosphere in the village hall, but Miss Marple observed that while Inspector Slack focused on the dramatic revelations about fraudulent pension claims and false identities, the real story lay in the subtle psychological currents flowing beneath the surface of shocked reactions and defensive explanations. She had positioned herself near the charity stall, ostensibly organizing the remaining donated items, but her pale blue eyes moved with practiced efficiency between the assembled villagers and the evidence that others dismissed as insignificant domestic details. The murder weapon itself continued to fascinate her, not for its obvious function, but for what it revealed about the person who had wielded it with such calculated precision. Mrs. Fleming sat rigidly beside her daughter, maintaining the protective posture she had assumed throughout the afternoon. But Miss Marple noted subtle changes in her demeanor as the investigation progressed. The older woman's hands moved repeatedly to smooth her navy cardigan, fingers tracing the fine knitted fabric with unconscious defensiveness, and the faint scent of Parma violets that clung to her clothing seemed to intensify under the pressure of scrutiny. Inspector Slack's attention remained focused on the obvious motives: financial desperation, family shame, fraudulent claims. But Miss Marple understood that the most dangerous criminals were often those who killed not from desperation, but from the calculating determination to protect carefully constructed deceptions. She approached Mrs. Fleming with the gentle manner of a village lady making polite conversation, her knitting basket held loosely in her hands. "Such a terrible afternoon for all of us, Mrs. Fleming," she began, her voice carrying the conversational tone that had served her so well in previous investigations. "One feels quite unsettled by these shocking revelations. Though I must say, your cardigan is quite lovely, such exquisite workmanship. One rarely sees knitting of such quality these days." Mrs. Fleming's response carried a flicker of pride despite her obvious distress. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It was my mother's pattern. She had wonderfully skilled hands with wool and needles." Miss Marple nodded appreciatively, her gaze moving over the finely crafted stitches with the attention of someone who understood the language of yarn and tension. "Indeed, and one can tell so much about a person from their knitting, don't you think? The choice of materials, the evenness of tension, the precision of the work. Some people knit loosely, with a relaxed hand, while others maintain such firm control that every stitch seems designed to hold something very important in place." A subtle change came over Mrs. Fleming's expression, a tightening around her eyes that suggested Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations had struck closer to home than mere compliments about needlework. Patricia, sensing her mother's increased tension, looked up with concern, but Mrs. Fleming maintained her composure with visible effort. "It requires considerable strength, doesn't it?" Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone, "to maintain such consistency under pressure. I've always found that people who knit with unusual tension often do so from long habit, perhaps developed during anxious evenings when steady work helps calm troubled thoughts." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond discussions of domestic crafts. Mrs. Fleming's breath caught almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple observed how the older woman's protective mask began to show hairline cracks under the sustained psychological pressure. Around them, the other villagers continued their shocked discussions of Ashford's deceptions and the implications of his professional investigation. But Miss Marple's attention remained focused on the subtle drama unfolding in their quiet corner of the hall. She had noticed earlier the single strand of dark blue wool caught on the cloakroom hook, excellent quality yarn that matched Mrs. Fleming's cardigan with remarkable precision. "One tries one's best to keep things together," Mrs. Fleming said finally, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested the effort was becoming increasingly difficult. For one's family, a mother must sometimes make difficult choices to protect those she loves. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained steady and understanding, but her next words carried the gentle precision of a surgeon's blade. Indeed, and sometimes when one is determined to protect what matters most, one might use whatever materials come to hand. A simple muffler, for instance, if handled by someone with the strength and determination born of long practice with wool and needles. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Mrs. Fleming's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her face going pale as the implications of Miss Marple's observation penetrated her defenses. For a moment, the elegant village matron disappeared entirely, replaced by something far more desperate and dangerous, a woman who had killed to protect secrets that could not survive exposure to daylight. The psychological pressure of Miss Marple's gentle but relentless observations had created a moment of terrible silence in the village hall. The comfortable sounds of the winter afternoon, the radiator's soft ticking, the whisper of snow against the windows, seemed to intensify in the sudden hush that had fallen over the assembled villagers. Mrs. Fleming sat rigidly in her chair, her carefully maintained composure finally showing hairline cracks under the weight of implications that could no longer be dismissed as innocent observations about domestic crafts. Inspector Slack, whose attention had been focused on building his case against Mr. Henderson, suddenly became aware of the drama unfolding in the quiet corner near the charity stall. His experience with criminal investigations had taught him to recognize the moment when psychological pressure achieved what formal questioning could not, and he moved toward Miss Marple and Mrs. Fleming with the careful attention of someone who sensed that the real solution to the case was finally emerging. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained steady and compassionate, but her next words carried the gentle precision of someone who had assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. "I'm afraid the evidence tells quite a clear story, Inspector, once one knows how to read it properly. You see, I noticed several small details that others might dismiss as insignificant domestic trivia, but which together form a rather compelling picture." She reached into her knitting basket and produced a single strand of dark blue wool, holding it up to catch the fading afternoon light. This thread was caught on a coat hook in the cloakroom, positioned at shoulder height for someone considerably shorter than the deceased. The quality is excellent, the particular luster that comes from superior materials and careful spinning. It matches Mrs. Fleming's cardigan with remarkable precision. Mrs. Fleming's breath caught audibly, her hands moving instinctively to smooth the navy fabric that had become both evidence and symbol of her guilt. Patricia looked between her mother and Miss Marple with growing comprehension and horror, her young face reflecting the bewildered pain of someone whose entire world was shifting beneath her feet. Furthermore, Miss Marple continued in her conversational tone, the murder weapon itself tells a fascinating story to those versed in the language of wool and needles. The knot was tied with unusual precision, not the hasty work of someone unfamiliar with such materials, but the controlled tension of someone who had spent years managing anxiety through needlework. The stitching pattern shows remarkably tight, even work, the kind that comes from long practice and considerable strength in the hands. Inspector Slack found his voice, though it carried a note of reluctant admiration. "Are you saying that Mrs. Fleming's knitting skills somehow prove—" "I'm saying that the physical evidence, when properly interpreted, points to someone with specific expertise and physical characteristics," Miss Marple replied gently. "Someone who knew exactly how to apply the right amount of pressure with steady, controlled movements. Someone who left behind the faint scent of Parma violets that I detected beneath the mothballs and damp wool in the cloakroom." The mention of her distinctive fragrance seemed to be the final straw for Mrs. Fleming's crumbling defenses. Her face went ashen, and the elegant village matron who had protected her daughter with such fierce determination began to dissolve before their eyes, replaced by something far more desperate and vulnerable. He was going to destroy everything, she whispered, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose deepest secrets had been laid bare to public scrutiny. 23 years of careful construction, of building a life for Patricia, of protecting her from truths that would have shattered her reputation and her future. Patricia reached for her mother's trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, what are you saying? What truths?" But Mrs. Fleming could not meet her daughter's eyes. The weight of her secret was literally crushing her ability to maintain the deception any longer, and Miss Marple observed with compassionate understanding how the older woman's breathing had become shallow and rapid under the enormous pressure of exposure. Inspector Slack stepped forward with official authority, recognizing that the psychological dam had finally burst. "Mrs. Fleming, I think you'd better tell us exactly what happened in that cloakroom during the carol singing." The confession was about to begin, and everyone in the village hall understood that they were witnessing the tragic culmination of a mother's desperate attempt to protect her child from the consequences of secrets that had festered in darkness for more than 2 decades. The psychological pressure had reached its breaking point, and Mrs. Fleming's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely under the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. Her breathing had become shallow and labored, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she struggled to find words for truths that had been buried beneath decades of careful deception. The elegant village matron who had protected her daughter with such fierce maternal determination was dissolving before their eyes, replaced by someone far more vulnerable and desperate. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained steady and compassionate as she continued her gentle but inexorable revelation. "The evidence tells quite a clear story, Inspector, once one understands how to read the language of domestic details. The blue thread caught on the cloakroom hook matches Mrs. Fleming's cardigan precisely. Excellent quality wool with that particular luster that comes from superior materials. More tellingly, it was positioned at shoulder height for someone of her stature, not Mr. Ashford's." She paused, allowing the implications to settle before continuing in her conversational tone. "The murder weapon itself reveals the hand of someone with considerable expertise in handling wool and needles. The knot was tied with the controlled precision that comes from years of managing tension in knitting, not the desperate fumbling of someone unfamiliar with such materials. And beneath the mothballs and damp wool in that confined space, I detected the unmistakable scent of Parma violets, Mrs. Fleming's distinctive fragrance." Inspector Slack, recognizing the moment of breakthrough, stepped forward with official gravity. "Mrs. Fleming, I think you'd better tell us exactly what happened during the carol singing." The dam finally burst. Mrs. Fleming's voice, when it came, carried the hollow quality of complete defeat mixed with an almost palpable relief at no longer having to maintain her exhausting charade. "He knew everything," she whispered, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the village hall walls. "About the pension fraud, about Patricia's father, about the lies I've told for 23 years to protect her from the truth." Patricia's face reflected the bewildered anguish of someone whose entire world was crumbling around her. "Mama, please, what are you saying? What about Papa?" Mrs. Fleming finally met her daughter's eyes, and the love and desperation that was almost too painful to witness. "Your father didn't die heroically in the war, darling. He abandoned us when you were barely 2 years old, ran off with another woman, and never looked back. I've been collecting his widow's pension illegally for over 2 decades, telling everyone he was a war hero who died serving his country. I built our entire respectable life on that foundation of lies." The confession struck the assembled villagers like a physical blow, shattering their comfortable assumptions about respectability and the reliability of carefully maintained social facades. Mrs. Fleming's voice grew stronger as the burden of secrecy lifted, though her words carried the weight of terrible resignation. "Mr. Ashford approached me during the afternoon while everyone was distracted. He wasn't interested in cataloguing antiques. He was a professional blackmailer who had discovered my deception. He wanted money to keep quiet, but I understood it would never end. Men like that always return for more, and eventually Patricia would have learned the truth in the most humiliating way possible. She described following him to the cloakroom when he went to collect his coat, hoping to reason with him, to make him understand that destroying Patricia's reputation would serve no constructive purpose. But he had laughed at her maternal pleas, telling her that respectability was a luxury that people like them couldn't afford. I saw the donated muffler hanging among the charity items, she continued, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone reciting events they had replayed countless times. My years of needlework had given me the strength and skill to know exactly how much pressure to apply. It was over very quickly. He was taken completely by surprise. Then I arranged his position and returned to the main hall before anyone noticed my absence. Patricia's sobs had become the only sound in the village hall apart from her mother's quiet confession. The young woman clung to Mrs. Fleming's hands as though physical contact could somehow prevent the inevitable separation that formal justice would demand. Inspector Slack completed the formalities with respectful efficiency, understanding that while the law must take its course, the human tragedy unfolding before them deserved dignity rather than theatrical drama. Mrs. Fleming accepted the charges with weary resignation, the look of someone who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. Miss Marple watched the proceedings with compassionate understanding, recognizing that the real crime had begun 23 years earlier with a desperate young mother's decision to protect her child from stigma and poverty. The winter gathering had indeed become something far more sinister than anyone could have anticipated, revealing how respectability could exact such a terrible price from those desperate enough to pay it. The formalities concluded with the quiet dignity that Inspector Slack had learned to employ in such delicate village matters. Mrs. Fleming was led away with her composure intact, the terrible burden of 23 years of secrecy finally lifted from her shoulders. Patricia remained in the care of Dr. Haydock and several village ladies, her world forever changed but surrounded by the compassionate support that small communities could provide in times of genuine crisis. As the village hall slowly emptied, Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple with the awkward gratitude of a man who recognized he had been steered from serious error. "I was quite wrong about Henderson," he admitted, consulting his notebook with visible embarrassment. "If you hadn't noticed those details about the knitting—" Miss Marple smiled gently, folding her needlework with practiced precision. "One learns to read the language of domestic details, Inspector." Mrs. Fleming's years of anxiety had given her both the skill and the strength necessary for such precise work. The knot was tied with the controlled tension that comes from managing worry through needlework, not the desperate fumbling of someone unfamiliar with such materials. "The London firm has been most cooperative," Slack continued, his professional satisfaction evident. "Seems our Mr. Ashford had discretion to verify the Cardew inheritance, nothing more. He took it upon himself to cultivate what they delicately term extra income. We've found carbon copies of demand letters, quite the systematic blackmailer, our deceased gentleman." Dr. Haydock joined them, swinging his coat over his arm. "One can almost understand her desperation, though murder is never justified. The social stigma of abandonment in those days, the financial pressures of raising a child alone, she must have felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes taking in the remnants of what had been intended as a cheerful, charitable gathering. The most dangerous criminals are often those who believe they're protecting something precious. Mrs. Fleming didn't kill for money or passion. She killed to preserve the carefully constructed world she had built for Patricia's benefit. In her mind, she was still being a good mother, even as she committed murder. Patricia approached them with Reverend Clement close behind, the young woman's face marked by tears but oddly composed, as though having reached the bottom of despair, she had discovered solid ground. "Miss Marple," she said in a voice that was small but steady, "what should I do now?" "Tell the truth from now on, my dear," Miss Marple replied with practical kindness. "Begin with that, and everything else has a way of falling into its proper place. People can be unkind at first and kinder later. You will find your way." Reverend Clement inclined his head. "There are provisions for hardship and kindly households with room at table. My sister has already offered a month in Bath, should you wish to get away from all this." Mr. Henderson, released from suspicion but visibly shaken by his near brush with false accusation, approached with obvious relief. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Marple. The financial troubles documented in that notebook, well, they're real enough, but hardly worth killing over. Human nature reveals itself in the smallest details," Miss Marple observed. "Your fear was gauche rather than guilty, Mr. Henderson. There's quite a difference, though both can appear similar to the casual observer." The winter evening had settled over St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the promise of eventual healing that small communities possessed in remarkable measure. The paper chains still hung cheerfully from the rafters, and the radiators continued their comfortable wheezing, but the atmosphere had been forever altered by the revelation of how far maternal love could drive someone when desperation and protective instincts collided with insurmountable circumstances. Walking home through the gently falling snow, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Mrs. Fleming's situation. The very skills that had made her such an accomplished needlewoman, the strength in her hands, the precision of her movements, the ability to maintain steady tension under pressure, had also made her capable of committing murder with calculated efficiency. Julian Ashford had come to St. Mary Mead as a predator, using his supposed inheritance as cover for systematic blackmail, but he had fatally underestimated the fierce protective instincts of a mother who had spent decades building a life based on carefully maintained deceptions. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple paused to look back at the village hall, now dark except for a single window where the last official business was being concluded. The winter gathering would be remembered not for its charitable purposes, but as a reminder that respectability could exact such a terrible price from those desperate enough to pay it. Human nature, she had learned through long experience, was capable of both extraordinary love and terrible violence, often within the same person and driven by the same protective instincts. In her quiet parlor, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled her knitting in her lap. The wool ran smooth under her fingers, each stitch a small decision made firmly and then left behind. Outside, the village would heal, as villages always do, one small kindness at a time.